Once you pass about 5 o'clock at night, you're going to stay overnight for the social reason, not the medical reason. And once you're in that bed, you're at risk of all the bad things that can happen in a hospital environment, falls, and the societal cost of that is tens of thousands of pounds a year. That's failure on every level.
Meet Shane Gordon, who's nowadays the Executive Managing Director of the Norfolk and Norwich University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust, which is part of the Norfolk Acute Trust Group, a £3 billion investment in the future of NHS care, and a leader who's rewriting the rulebook on how hospitals actually work. This is Shane Gordon. Let's go.
What we've managed to do in the space of about 8 weeks is close the escalation ward and almost eliminate ambulance offload delays. Because the received wisdom is that when you've got all this pressure, you open more beds to put the patients in. We've done the exact opposite, which is close beds, close escalation spaces, and the whole flow has got better. There seems to be an obvious solution to this, which actually doesn't make it better.
So it's great to be joined on this episode of the Delivery by Design podcast by Dr. Shane Gordon, who's nowadays the Executive Managing Director of the Norfolk and Norwich University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust, which is part of the Norfolk Acute Trust Group. And we'll hear more about that later. But previously, Shane's worked in other trusts, including in Norfolk, and for a long time as the Executive Director of Strategy, Research and Innovation in the East Suffolk and North Essex NHS Foundation Trust. And before that, he's had a role as a commissioner and started as a GP and has played roles on a national stage as well as regional and local. So Shane brings a huge amount of experience, and I'm really looking forward to getting to this conversation. So thank you so much for joining us, Shane.
It's my great pleasure, Alastair. It's lovely to see you again. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, that's great. Well, things feel like they've come a long way since the first days we did work together when you were in the CCG. Gosh, we may even be talking nearly 15 years ago. And nowadays, you find yourself as the Executive Managing Director of a large, complex trust in the middle of a group, in the middle of a large county of Norfolk. So do you want to say a little bit about, like, what does the operating model mean for you as the Managing Director of Norfolk and Norwich?
We're a hospital group rather than a merged multi-site hospitalisation. That means we've got 3 foundation trusts that have agreed to have a committee in common serve as their board, and therefore we still each technically have a board, and we have councils of governors and non-executives and things like that, but they are the same people for all. The board elements are the same people for all 3.
Right.
I think gives everybody a bit of a head stretch when they try to think about how that works. What it means in practical terms is that there are some governance structures at site. So I have my top level governance meeting is a hospital management group, and that is fed by 3 management groups underneath, which deal with quality and safety, people and culture, finance and performance, all very traditional ways of filtering up the right information and risk management. And that they feed into the group executive and thence to the committees of the group board. One of the big changes is the only executive roles that are site-based in the group board are the managing directors. So I have a team of directors, but they are not executive directors in the strict sense of the constitutional representation on the board. And I have peers that I work with at the group who hold the statutory roles of medicine, nursing, and finance alongside our chief executive, Leslie Dwyer. And so that creates some new dynamics that we have to navigate in working together. And we're still only a year into being a group as well. So it's easy to forget how much forming and storming there is required to get to any semblance of a steady state in any arrangement like this. And our first formal group board meeting, where we had all of the statutory roles populated and all of the non-executive roles populated, was only in December of last year. So in terms of a fully functioning board, we'd only really been going for 5 months. so 4.5 months so far.
Right.
It's early days in terms of the formation of the group. There's a lot of work been done on looking at the operating model. What are the reserved matters for the group board? What are the autonomous matters for the site? And that's really important. We might talk about those later if that was interesting. And particularly, what's the risk management model? So we've adopted and slightly modified the model from the Liverpool group with a lot of support from David Dalton in doing that process. But essentially, the theory behind that is the way that we manage a complex structure like this that has 3 hospitals that are hard enough to run in their own, run them as a group, is through very agile and careful attention to risk management as the primary mechanism for communicating the issues that need to come across the boards alongside our performance measures are used as a tool for the board to get assurance and awareness of what's going on by triangulating our risk perception against the performance issues and the board's external perception of threat, and how well we are mitigating those risks and managing them down. One of our it's not a performance measure, but it's a sort of soft indicator of how well it's working, is how quickly risks are coming up to the board threshold and back down again out of the board threshold, and how well that triangulates with what the board are seeing performance data, hearing through the non-executives and the governors and the public, NHSE in our performance meetings, and triangulating those things together to tell them where they need to pay attention to supporting me and my peers at the site, when necessary, starting to step into the space in the sites to bring things together. So that's the operating model from a governance perspective. We also have tactical and strategic spaces that we work together in. So we've got all 3 trusts started the national oversight framework in segment 4, the wrong end of the new league table. And we could argue the merits of the league table till the cows come home, but that's how we're judged in the round for our delivery against what's required for the NHS and the people we serve. We have a group-wide recovery program for that called One Recovery that's got 6 plus 1 if you count CIP, but 6 strands to it, which are focused on maximising the opportunity of working together to move us forward on the areas of key performance improvement to get us into a better state on the delivery of the key priorities nationally. So that's one operational response to how we work as a group, is to come together and to spread the leadership of that across the 3 trusts. So we've got operational and clinical leadership in each of those strands on behalf of the group. So my trust leading on cancer,
Right.
as an example, in that programme of work, on behalf of the 3 trusts, and then elective work led elsewhere and as parts of our outpatients, etc. So it's trying to not have everybody doing everything separately, but start to say, okay, we're going to share the leadership of some of these things, maximise the capacity and the talent in the group to do that. And the response to that for us in the areas we're not leading is to be good followers, participants in that, but take the opportunity to standardized approaches, policies, clinical models, clinical systems, operational approaches and systems, and even movement of staff where necessary to stabilize and improve services, so that we can do that as agilely as possible. And then in the strategic space, we have a program called One Strategy. We like ones in Norfolk. It comes to getting us into that group space with support from management consultancy. We're developing a strategy that takes us forward as a group into the future. And of course, there's some really important big strategic elements in the Norfolk system which make extra important, which are 2 hospitals in the new hospital programme, a £3 billion investment in those new hospitals over the next 5 to 7 years, and a group-wide EPR that we're implementing at the moment, which will be a single instance of the EPR across all 3 hospitals, which is tricky to pull off. But when we've done it, will facilitate reshaping of clinical pathways across the group. It's an essential tool for doing that. Those are big kind of drivers for having a single strategy across the group. So that's going to be really exciting as that emerges in the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, I mean, it is a challenging context, as you know, as you describe, and the challenges of 2 of your colleague hospitals being coastal hospitals, some of the difficulties of therefore attracting, retaining workforce, etc., and the kind of demand challenges of an aging population in Norfolk. I mean, I think it's the group has got a big challenge. So, and it's early days, but have you begun to see, you know, changes in the way clinicians and some of the pathways are beginning to work across hospitals? Is that already starting to happen, or am I being too optimistic?
Absolutely. I mean, it's early days to see concrete results from that, but I'm certainly seeing the conversations amongst our clinicians, they're starting to open with, and we're talking to our colleagues at the other hospitals. And we've got a number of services that have, in the last few years, under more of a provider collaborative footing, started to be networked across the group, which are working more or less well. I think in the round, they're working, they solved problems of fragility of services that were long standing for urology, gynecology, and ENT, and they're not perfect. And I would, the way I liken it is they're like writing the first one you do is not perfectly structured. The next one's a bit better. By the time you've done the 10th one, you're getting fairly slick at it. And I think we're in that sort of process where every time we do one of these service integrations, we've learned the lessons from the last time, and we're going to go back to the ones we started with and optimize those in the light of when we're doing it better in the next services. So we've got some other ones that are quite live at the moment. So there's work going on pediatric audiology across the group, which is fragile in many places and is a live example across the country, really, where we're working together to use capacity in a smart way, use estate and people, and even applying outsourcing in a smart way that helps with across the group rather than just one of the hospitals. General surgery is another live example. Oncology services, where we're deep into discussions as a group about how we support some of the more fragile tumour sites with their workload. Radiology, where we'll be going into procurement hopefully for a single PACS RIS platform across the group, which again then is an enabler for supporting the redesign of clinical pathways right way across. The list goes on. We're seeing the level of collaboration across our clinical services now on a different footing than it's been previously, but I don't have any illusions that that's just because the group has formed. I think that's based on a long run-up of increasing collaboration in the Norfolk system that actually was part of what enabled the group to form in the first place. So yeah, the group is bringing it into sharp focus, but this has been warming up for several years, and got to recognize we're standing on the shoulders of giants, of people who set the conditions for that to happen, who are many of whom are still working in the system.
For people who don't know Norfolk, I mean, it's quite rural. Some of the, particularly North Norfolk, we're getting quite isolated populations. The travel times are quite long. You're not blessed with many motorways once you've got to Norwich or
There are motorways into the county.
They're none. No, the A14 is quite fast, but it isn't great. So, and historically,
and it's single track for quite a part.
It is. So the collaboration bit is not easy, and as you said, it's taken quite a lot of time to warm people up. So when you come to those collaborations around fragile services or some of the services, I guess one of the dangers is that you will have most of the time in the N&N the bulk of the clinical resource, the bulk of the expertise, and how does it not feel to everyone like N&N is taking over? I mean, that must be a dynamic. That how do we collaborate well, make best use of what we've got without it feeling like it's centralization? So,
and it's a challenge whenever you do these sorts of integrations.
Yes.
So, as you said, my first role in Norfolk a year ago was actually doing this same role title at the James Paget in Great Yarmouth on the coast in one of the two smaller hospitals in the group, hearing very clearly from the staff that they were worried that the group meant a Norfolk and Norwich takeover, trying to have the conversation that says, well, what we're all here for is the best care for all of our patients in Norfolk. And our challenge as clinicians and as leaders in the system is to find the optimal way to provide the best care for our patients. That can't mean no change. And indeed, there are no services that have not been changing forever. It's just that, we put a lot of effort into setting them up a particular way, and then we get, we understandably are anxious when somebody comes along, usually with some management consultancy, forgiven, and tells us that we're not doing it right, we could do it differently. We have to, take a step back and say, what are we here for? We're here for our communities and for our patients. And the reality is that some of our services are finding it very difficult to sustain the level of quality and access to services that our populations deserve. And where we are achieving that, some of those services are requiring an excessive amount of investment to do that. That means we're depriving other services of needed investment for their quality and access. So we've got, that doesn't make the conversations on an individual clinician service staff member basis any easier, but it is the modern leadership challenge in healthcare. The starting point for our services currently is that almost all of our hospitals are working in a DGH model from the 1950s. So we're trying to provide all services for all patients in all places, which is, my dad was from Northern Ireland, and he would say that's the Irish directions, isn't it? If you were going there, I wouldn't start from here.
Yes.
So we've got to try to break out of that. And that happens by some good strategic leadership conversations and some good data provided by management consultancy usually, or our own insight. And but then has to get down into, okay, clinicians, if that's the circumstances we find ourselves in, how are you as the clinical community going to help us get to the better place? And that does involve quite lengthy reflection and deliberation and persuasion, but at some stage we've got to bring that to a conclusion and say, actually, now we have to move and we have to act. And there are a number of ways in which that happens. So getting into crisis is one of those. That's probably the least favoured way of doing it, but unfortunately is often the trigger for some of these things, where we get to a point where we say, okay, we can't sustain this now, we're going to have to do it differently. Or we get to a more proactive trigger, like we're going to build a new hospital, but what we can't do is build a DGH again, because DGHs were for the 1950s, and what we need is a hospital that's going to be there in another 50 years doing the right things for the population in whatever that looks like, which almost certainly is not doing everything for everybody everywhere. It's going to be much more nuanced. So that's another trigger for getting people to focus. Yeah, the other is finding ways to unlock ambition. So quite often when you get clinicians into a room and you say, what would the best version of your service be? And then we find a way to unlock some of that through, some capital investment or some development of service models or staff or other technology, and find a way to liberate the energy and the enthusiasm for change in that way. We have to be cunning as leaders in finding lots of ways to get people to the tipping point of acting. But actually, when you talk to them, they know that we need to do something different. They're not got their head in the sand. It's just what the different is they might struggle to agree on.
I'm intrigued as to what's your experience of working in this group setting, new and developing and emerging as it is, compared to, particularly your experience, I guess, in SNF, but your previous leadership roles. What's the difference? Because you might say, well, you had 2 big hospitals in SNF, you've only got 3 in Norfolk, can't be that different.
Yeah, and it's fascinating comparing those two experiences. I had the great privilege under Nick Hume's leadership of leading the merger process that created ESNEFT, learning a lot about how these things work and don't work in that process, apply liberally in how we tackle things here. But we've got, other leaders in the group who've been through similar sort of processes or been part of group or merged hospital models elsewhere. So it's not a solo sport by any means. I think the big contrast is that group has been able to form and start acting much quicker than a merger. So I think when I led the ESNEF merger, it took 23 months start to finish, which at the time was the fastest ever NHS trust merger. I think I've been outdone by one or two subsequently, but that was considered pretty quick at the time. But they do take 1.5 to 2 years to do these merger processes. And a lot of that is in writing the perfect plan. It's never perfect. So you write the plan and it's as good as it can be to get everybody to do it. And then you work out how to do it afterwards, how to optimize it. Whereas the group is imperfect in the way it sets up its governance structures. It's a bit clunky because it's not a single organisation. It's still 3 foundation trusts under the bonnet, but has been able to start acting and making change happen much more quickly. And I think in the current environment, particularly in Norfolk, in the difficult starting point we find ourselves in, I would rather not spend 2 years working out what we ought to be doing. I'm glad we are moving on doing some things that are hopefully already making a difference.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess that your role, the exec managing director roles, are absolutely critical in that group working, because you've got the legitimate taking that, the sort of superstructure of the group in a way, and the grip into and the working with your clinical and operational colleagues within the trust. And as you've described earlier, you also have some group wide roles. And so I suppose the fulcrum, you must be a lot of the fulcrum for making that matrix work within the group.
It's true because we are the interface between
Yeah.
the group and the sites. And the reality for any organisation involved with running hospital care is that all of the risk sits in the delivery of clinical care. It's what happens every day in our wards and departments. And therefore, keeping that connection working really well and not allowing the group to be separate from what we are as the sites is the trick we've got to pull off. And I think everybody's very aware of that as a risk. So a lot of that comes down to how we work the relationships with the group leaders and people who are operating across the 3 trusts in concert with us as managing directors. It's fair to say we're still fully installing, as I said, in that process and learning how to operate that really well. But I'm already seeing great examples of where directors at the group level are offering significant support and insight and value to my team on the site in their areas of specialised function, and just as kind of peers to advise and help with difficult situations. So I think we're moving into a frame where it doesn't feel like I'm in a sort of lonely space in between some big rocks, which I think it would be the risk. But it's feeling much more like I've got a wider network of support and advice to manage the really complex challenges we've got, many of which are not soluble even as the mighty Norfolk and Norwich. And that's why we're in a group, isn't it? So we have to keep reminding everybody that there's a reason we formed a group, and it's because it didn't work the other way around to a level that was acceptable for our communities.
Yeah. Probably didn't work for any of the 3 trusts on their own, I guess is the reality of the history. And then if you add in the 2 RAC hospitals, new hospital programs, you've kind of got a level at which, as you said, it kind of makes sense. But it's easy to forget that when I guess you're in challenge.
Yeah, particularly as things start to improve.
Right.
It's easy to go back into, well, what has the group ever done for us? We've sorted ourselves out. Why do we need the group? So we're going to have to hold tightly to that, particularly as if we get some differential in the improvement rate at the different sites. So there's types of challenges that are easier to deal with at each of the 3 sites. And therefore, there's always a risk of getting into that conversation. So just got to keep reminding ourselves that some of that forward movement and management of risk is because we are a group. Some of our ability to interface with the external environment is, we're doing it once rather than 3 times. So that creates some bandwidth, and we're spending some of that bandwidth on then reinvesting in collaborating better. So there is, if we get that right, there's a virtuous cycle of the role of the group in supporting the sites, but we're not separate. And I think it's really easy to feel separate because we talk about the group as a thing, but we are the group. We're all part of the group.
I'm intrigued about your role. How much time do you spend, in the classic N&N that a chief exec or a coup would spend in the N&N if it was a single trust? And how much of the time are you spending with the kind of group things? I mean, it may be hard to differentiate the two, but I'd be intrigued as to how that works out.
They're not entirely separate because the things
Yeah.
does are also part of the agenda, but
Yes.
how much time am I spending in group interface things as opposed to working in the site? I would say probably 70 or 75% of my time is focused on the site.
Right.
And I would include in that interfaces with our partners in the Norwich Research Park and the university, and about 25% spent on group things. But the group things are investment in what we do in the sites.
Indeed.
I wouldn't want to make an artificial separation and say that, that's not really helpful work for us in the sites. It is a different dynamic to working just as an organisation that is on one site. But that was true in ESNEFT as well.
Yeah, well, and I interviewed Shane DeGarris, who's the chief exec of Barts Health, and he's also chairs the.
You've got a
NHS.
series of Shanes lined up, clear.
We do. There must. He's very articulate about the benefit of the group model, and he could describe for Barts. Obviously, it's a very mature model, and some of those benefits, and they've got a very clear operating model that has, they call them chief execs and management teams for each of their hospitals. So it sounds more similar to where you are, whereas there are other groups where the balance between what is at group level and done at group level and what's done at site level within the individual varies. Obviously, Barts is a single FT now, so it's different. You're still a group of 3 separate foundation trusts. So it's interesting hearing the kind of articulation of, yeah, there are other things we can do as a group that if we were just a trust, it would be could be a bit of a lonely process. So it sounds like you're beginning to see those benefits coming out.
I'm really feeling it now. I think it was harder going last year as we were still really putting the team together for the group. But now that we've got a stronger team established in the group, there are more areas of subject matter experts as part of that team that we can draw on to support our teams in doing their work and working out how we optimize our corporate services, which we are restructuring as group corporate services. Really interesting and somewhat stressful journey, but it's going to be, I think, really positive. I'm really feeling the benefit of having that support from across the group to help me do the difficult things I've got to do at the Norfolk and Norwich. So really starting to get into a place where it's more comfortable than it is effortful, because we've got through that sort of initial gathering momentum phase.
And I guess the key measures from the outside system, from the ICB and NHS England, will become what's happening on your A&E performance, your ambulance handovers, your RTTs and the finances. And I guess the question is, how long will it take for them to see those things turning around? And are they still measuring you on an individual trust basis rather than looking at you as a group?
Well, I think it's our colleagues at NHS England in the region are being really helpful in trying to make that as less onerous as possible. So we, as statutory organisations, as foundation trusts, they have an obligation to look at us individually. But we are now doing like today, we had a performance oversight meeting with the region that we did as a group. So that was good because it meant we used the same amount of time once that we would have done, and we would have spent that same time 3 times to do it separately. So that was really beneficial. And of course, they're looking at us both as a group and individually on all the usual performance measures. So things that we've already started to demonstrate as benefits is we ended the year last year as a group in financial balance. That's the first time in many, many years in Norfolk.
I was going to say, wow. Congratulations. That is a turnaround. Yeah.
We also, in the Q4 elective sprint, were able to work as a group to allow us to meet the sprint criteria and do more elective activity collectively than we would have been able to do separately. I think as the Norfolk and Norwich, we might have been the highest outturn Q4 sprint in the country. We really went hard at it, but we took nearly 14,000 patients off our waiting list in Q4, which is, for those patients who've been waiting months, if not years, to get a diagnosis and a treatment plan, that's a phenomenal benefit. And some of that was because we were operating as a group and we were able to organise ourselves well to take advantage of it. As the Norfolk and Norwich, we'd made progress that we outperformed our plan on almost every measure in the last year. Some of those results are the best results we've had in 7 years in cancer performance, for example, and RTT performance. We've done really well in the 4-hour standard, and actually starting, we've got ambulance offload delays starting to come back under control for the first time in a long time. Some of those have significant group input into. So we'll see more of that as we're doing more of the planning for this year and next year as a group. We'll start to see more standardisation of our approaches, for example, around urgent care, and that hopefully will give us more forward momentum.
I'm also interested, Shane, I don't think there are many people who will be a chief executive or an executive managing director who were GPs or are GPs, came from that background. Did you want to say a little bit about how your executive leadership, your GP and clinical experiences shaped that? Because that's the relationship within the hospital, but also with GP, with partners and others externally. I'd be fascinated as to how you found that.
I'm not practicing as a genetic. I'm not quite sure I've got the bandwidth to do that, but
I would imagine. Yeah.
But I think having the clinical background makes a significant difference in a number of ways. So just a little example, yesterday we had a consultant briefing event organised by my wonderful medical director, Tanya Marshall. I was chatting to a colleague who came in slightly early, who's a paediatric ophthalmologist. And I said, how's the day been? And he said, well, I've been in theatre injecting Lucentis into the eyes of very premature babies to stop them going blind. I said, oh, that's great. I didn't know you could use Lucentis in premature babies. I thought that was for macular degeneration. He gave me a slightly quizzical look, and I said, how is it the same sort of process of capillary proliferation as in AMD? And he said, are you clinical? I said, yeah. I said, I'm a GP, so I know a little bit about everything and not a lot of anything. And just the relationship was there immediately, and he I think felt appreciated that I'd understood the amazing thing that he was doing in stopping a 30-week gestation baby from losing its sight. It just blows my mind how amazing that is. He felt, I hope, appreciated by me, that I'd understood what he was doing and thought it was amazing and got it immediately without him having to go into some sort of complicated explanation. And I'm not under any illusion that gives me a free pass with all of our consultants in their many frustrations, but it does mean I can understand some of the elements of what they're trying to do clinically and how they're approaching it as doctors in their desire to improve and develop their services. Maybe helps us understand each other better and more quickly, and therefore move on to okay, how can I help you, and how can you help the mission of the organisation in what you want to do, and get into a sort of beneficial set of conversations as leaders together in the organisation. With our primary care colleagues, I've been developing a relationship with the Norfolk Primary Care Collaborative, which is interesting. I've also covered the Great Yarmouth population, so that's been developing for over a year, and who are really keen to work with us to do left shift and neighbourhood health work. And I can absolutely see the potential in primary care to do that, and hopefully again meet them halfway, lean into those agendas. And I think that's developing into a really positive dialogue and set of rather concrete proposals for things that we could do differently and relatively quickly without requiring investment in hospital services. There might be little bits where we do need things unblocking with a little bit of investment, but most of the investment absolutely has to go into primary care and community services to make those things work. But we need to make sure that our teams and specialists are supporting and enabling our colleagues in the community to maximise their ability to meet the needs of patients and our communities through the things that we can offer, like specialist advice, but also potentially some of the infrastructure that we can offer and support. So we're trying to get into that space really quickly. And again, I'm not unique in my ability to do that in the group. I've got other very experienced colleagues in the other two hospitals who are doing exactly that, having the same conversations. It gets the conversation started quickly when you have a clinical background. So I think that is quite helpful.
And in terms of you began to touch on what it might mean for your kind of operating model and how you organize the kind of 10-year plan, the left shifts. So you've got the PR will be a big challenge. So the digital shift, but also that left shift into neighbourhood, hopefully more into preventative care. How do you see you're going to have to evolve how you organise and how you work to kind of facilitate the three shifts?
Yeah, so we've been giving this a lot of thought. So the first thing is we've got to use a population health management approach. So we've got to be data driven, looking for the opportunities for the highest addressable acute spend, and identifying patients whose needs could be met in other settings that are far more efficient at dealing with them than we are. And it was my chief operating officer who helpfully reminded people yesterday that we charge £160 for a first outpatient appointment. That's more than the GP allocation for a year's worth of care for a patient. So, really important that we keep that in our eye line, that we are great. We do some amazing things like the pediatric ophthalmology thing I mentioned earlier that you can't do anywhere else except in an acute hospital. And those things we absolutely have to do, and we need to do them really well. But we do a heap of things that actually in other settings of care, somewhere in the UK and definitely internationally, are routinely done in primary care or in community settings. And actually we are over-engineered to do those things, and that takes resource away from managing proactive care for patients through primary and secondary prevention and through good health and well-being. So, and we're in this sort of, we have been for the last couple of decades really in that spiral of just loading more and more cost and expenditure into our hospitals, which has taken resource out of our communities. And then we wonder why more patients are turning up in our EDs and on our elective list. So we've got to back ourselves out of that position, and we need to be really intentional in our specialist care to enable that to happen. So that, I think, the routes that we take to do that, I think are relatively few in number, but they obviously hides a lot of complexity.
Yeah.
So I think the virtual MDT, virtual clinic model is really central. And much as I think advice and guidance has been a big feature of national policy, I'm going to be rather heretical and say, as a clinician, advice and guidance works for nobody, because it takes, when you get to the advice and guidance stages, I want advice or guidance. What I don't want is a pen pal in Australia that takes 3 weeks to respond. And by that time, the patient has gone to a different setting of care because I've run out of capability to manage their risk. So that's about as much use as a chocolate teapot. What I did have when I was training as a GP was, GPs, we generally top out in the old money at SHO level. I don't know what that is in the new, I can't get my head around the new, medical training nomenclature. But, we'd have 2 or 3 years of experience working in hospital settings, maybe a bit more than that in some specialties. And when we're working in clinic in that setting, we do as much as we can within our competence. And when we get stuck, we know we've got a senior colleague next door and we can pop our head around the door and say, I've got a patient, they've got this, I think we should do this, but I quite value your advice. And they'd say, yeah, do this, this and this. Or they come and stick their head around the door and say, yeah, you're on the right lines, or no, have you thought about? And in that interaction, we learn and we grow in confidence and competence. And then that stops as soon as we qualify as GPs and we go and we sit like monks in our cells never talking to another colleague again. I'm exaggerating for effect, obviously. But largely our practice is isolated. And we haven't got that benefit of the rapid advice and guidance that we used to get in clinic. So we can recreate that virtually. And I have this crazy idea that we could have a small number of our specialists in the common long-term and elective conditions that we get high traffic from our GPs, sitting on teams with slots bookable every 7 minutes, like a clinic. And for a GP to book into and say, right, I know I need a rheumatology advice for a patient I was seeing this morning. Oh, there's a slot available this afternoon. Okay, Mrs. Smith, I'll talk to the consultant this afternoon and then we'll come back and make a plan on the phone together or through Teams or whatever. And then I'd get that advice and guidance almost in the moment. And it might be a single specialty or it could be an MDT that gives that advice. That would be great for some more complex patients. And that creates the virtual clinic door for us to continue that cycle of feedback and advice and guidance and learning, and also building of relationships and trust across the clinical community. And I'm not nostalgic that we can go back to, the relationships we had when I trained, when there are a third of the number of consultants to GPs. We now got, 3 times as many consultants as we had back then. But those relationships are really important to how efficiently we operate and how we can trust each other as we shift the risk management from acute back into the community. That's one approach, the virtual clinics. Virtual wards, I think, are much more established for how we transfer patients back into a community setting. But I think there's much more to go out there, particularly in things like end-of-life care and in some of the medical specialties, again, of extending the scope, the risk threshold at which we can transfer patients into those community settings of care. And that might need partnership with our community services and our GPs to enable us to do that. So great, let's do that together. And then I think we've got some technology-enabled spaces like the patient experience portals, where we are not at all taking advantage of the very clever condition management offerings in our patient experience portals. I mentioned a brand. There are only a small number out there, and they're all quite capable platforms. So if we can get used to trying to manage some of our clinical pathways, either on a risk stratified basis, there'll be patients that can be managed 100% through those, those clinical pathways. I was talking to Ewan Cameron, my counterpart at West Suffolk Hospital, at a reentry away day a couple of weeks ago. And we were talking about inflammatory bowel disease as a clinical pathway. So when you've got you're in surveillance for inflammatory bowel disease, really all that happens when you come to the hospital for 3 out of your 4 visits a year is we say, how are your symptoms? Fill in this questionnaire, standard questions about your symptoms, and we'll take some blood tests from you. And then we'll say, oh, you're stable, aren't you? Thanks very much. We'll see you in 3 months. You could do all of that through the patient experience portal, including booking in for your blood tests. And then you'll hit a risk trigger in those where you need to come back and see somebody in clinic. Great. Or have an endoscopy or whatever it is. So you could shift a whole load of those patients straight to 100% digital management, at least for most of their care. And then there'll be other patients where you can do parts of their care much more digitally and keep the patient self-managing at home, really, and not even have primary care involved with that. And then there's some other technologies like mobile X-ray. So I've got the privilege of, for the last 3 years, chairing the Eastern Diagnostic Imaging Network across part of the East of England region, supported by an incredible team led by B. Anthony. One of the great projects that we've done in that network is the introduction of mobile X-ray, which I think we'd seen being done in the southwest of the country in Cornwall. We've been adopting it and piloting it locally for suspected hip fractures. So one of the first meetings I had walking around in this hospital when I arrived was with our radiographers who were heading out that day to do some mobile X-ray. And they loved it because it was, it's really different from their routine work, but it was also keeping patients out of hospital. And the people who fall over and we worried about their hips are frail. And when they hit our hospital, they're complex. And then we don't trust their environment to send them back to, even if they're well. And then we stick them in a bed for several days. And then they deteriorate and they lose their self-management skills and their confidence. And we can't get them back home. And you know how it goes. We end up with putting people into supported care when they could have been at home for the want of know whether they'd fractured their hip. So we've done that and it's working really well. Now we're going to extend it to chest x-rays. So people in respiratory difficulty being able to do their x-ray and their blood gases and a portable blood count. And then you've got a path where you can manage the patient at home with some specialist advice and not bring them to A&E at all.
Yeah. And then we're into the combination of then using patient experience, using your virtual wards, as you say. So to me, a lot of what you're probably dealing with is you describe as failure demand. We didn't deal with, we didn't get the right advice and the right support to people in the beginning. And although it looks like a lot of resource sometimes, stopping an acute admission with all the deterioration and the poor experience for people must be adding more value.
I mean, that example of a frail person who has not
Yes.
fractured their hip, but we're worried they are, and they come in at 7 o'clock at night. And once you pass about 5 o'clock at night, you're going to stay overnight because we can't get any services in to support you at home if we send you back again. So we tend to hang on to you for the social reason, not the medical reason. And once you're in that bed, you're at risk of all the bad things that can happen in a hospital environment, falls and infections and just general loss of muscle tone from sitting in a bed. And you then end up with people, a proportion of those people ending up needing a package of care or even worse, a residential care setting instead of being independent in their own home. The whole system, the societal cost of that is tens of thousands of pounds a year for the want of knowing they hadn't fractured their hip at home. So that's failure on every level, the individual failure for that patient, but the failure to manage resources and steward those well in the system, which we can absolutely do better.
I guess that's going to be the fascinating issue, is not just how you develop and organize the resources you've got as a trust, but when you think of at the group level, some of those things you go, well, actually, we've piloted it here. We now spread the good practice across the county, and there'll be some things where the scale is, well, we only need to do it once for all of Norfolk. I guess working with the ambulance service, particularly, and GP out of hours, etc. But it sounds like the judicious and use of your specialist expertise and resource, and some of it becoming mobile.
Yeah, mobile
Is
virtual.
mobile and virtual, rather than you're going to shift it lock, stock and barrel and move the money out, because to start with, the system is so hot. It's the slow reversal of that loop you described earlier, maybe.
Yeah, mate, I don't think it's entirely slow. So let's be clear, some of the money is already moving out. So, through unbundling of the tariff and the pace of change that we're doing with that money is being reinvested by our commissioners in neighbourhood health and left shift, and quite right too. What I want to see as a hospital leader is that is taking out, enabling us to take at least the same amount, but preferably the same amount plus a little bit more cost out of the hospital with the work, so that we're getting a benefit in the hospital from taking money out as well as in the community from doing that. I think there's some great examples of that. So over the last 3 months, we've had, coming out of the tail end of winter, we still had a lot of escalation space being used either in an escalation ward and in corridors, and at the same time, very long ambulance offload delays. I think we were the worst in the country in 1 week. So, really severe ambulance offload delays. What we've managed to do in the space of about 8 weeks is close the escalation ward, more than half the number of people in temporary escalation spaces in corridors and other places, and almost eliminate ambulance offload delays, which is, it's sort of heretical to say that that's possible, isn't it? Because the received wisdom is that when you've got all this pressure, you open more beds to put the patients in. We've done the exact opposite, which is close beds, close escalation spaces, and the whole flow has got better. And I think we've done that not particularly through left shift even. This is just better process in our hospitals. But I think it's also the closing of the ward particularly has put the expertise in nursing and to some extent other professions, therapies and medicine back in a smaller footprint. And that's enabled it to be more efficient. So I think there's some sort of counter, we get into, kind of received wisdom about some of this stuff, don't we? That there seems to be an obvious solution to this, which actually doesn't make it better.
So, and it's interesting because that's a brilliant sort of micro example of the sort of how can we make sure acute hospitals are adding the most value in the overall system of care. And as you said, can be counterintuitive. So I love some of the ideas that you've shared about, and seeing them work out will be fascinating. And what that ends up looking like for your trust in time when so many of your services start to become more virtual or mobile will be, I guess it'll always be at the relative margins, but it'll be interesting how that means the trust might start to feel different. And I guess it'll also drive a lot of research and development and innovation opportunities with your university partners, which is another exciting aspect, I think, of where you are as well. So, yeah, sounds like exciting times ahead.
They always are in the house. Very energized, but thanks very much.
Good. Well, thank you so much for your time, Shane. Really appreciate it. Been a fascinating conversation. Thank you.